The valley stretched before them like a mouth waiting to close. It was late afternoon, but the light was dim, filtered through a low ceiling of clouds that threatened rain. Each boot sank into the soggy ground with a squelch, leaving behind the sound of tired men and the smell of wet earth. To an outsider, it might have looked like a simple march, an ordinary movement of troops from one ridge to another. But to the men inside that column, it was something else entirely. A slow crawl into the unknown, where every shadow could conceal an enemy, and every rustle of leaves could be the whisper of death. The young soldier kept his place near the center of the line, trying to match his steps with those around him. His rifle rested against his shoulder, but his grip was tight, his knuckles pale from the pressure. He had been in uniform for only a handful of months, but war had aged him quickly. The laughter and boyishness that once lived in his face had been stripped away, leaving behind sharp lines of caution and exhaustion. The insignia stitched onto his shoulder felt heavier with every step. It was only a patch of fabric, but it carried weight he had never known before, weight that made him feel exposed, as if invisible eyes were fixed on it. Ahead of the column marched the colonel. Even in mud and mist, his figure seemed carved from stone. He carried himself with a strange mixture of ease and authority, as though the danger around them could not penetrate the armor of his will. His coat was buttoned high, his belt cinched tight, his boots coated in a layer of muck that he didn't bother to wipe away. He had the bearing of a man who had seen too much to fear the next moment. For the younger men, that confidence was a shield in itself. When the colonel was near, the chaos of war seemed just a little more manageable. But today, even his presence could not erase the tension that pressed down on them. The valley was too quiet. No birds called from the trees. No wind stirred the grass. The silence felt unnatural, like the pause between a predator's breath and its strike. The soldier noticed the way his comrades glanced nervously toward the ridges that flanked their path, their eyes darting between rocks and bush, as if expecting to see a rifle barrel emerge at any second. Each man carried not just his own fear, but also the fear of the others beside him. It was a chain reaction of nerves, and if one link broke, the whole line could collapse. The young soldier tried to steady his breathing. He told himself that he was ready, that his training would carry him through whatever came. But training never quite captured the reality of waiting for death. The manuals had spoken of formations, of tactics, of keeping a clear head under fire. They had never explained what it felt like to hear the thump of your own heartbeat echoing in your ears so loudly that you feared the enemy could hear it too. They had never explained how the simplest sound, a twig snapping, a stone rolling down a slope, could send shivers down the spines of hardened men. Behind him, one of the privates coughed. The sound was small, but it carried through the still air like a crack of thunder. Several heads turned, and the soldier saw fear etched on every face. They were walking into something. They didn't know what or when, but it was there, waiting. The colonel raised his hand, signaling the column to slow. His eyes swept the ridges, sharp and calculating. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His men read his silence like scripture. It meant danger was near. The young soldier's chest tightened. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, the leather squeaking softly under his grip. His eyes followed the colonel, studying every movement, every pause. There was something in the way the colonel moved, deliberate, unhurried, that forced the men to breathe slower, to keep from giving in to the rising tide of panic. If he was calm, they could be calm. Or at least, they could pretend to be. But pretending only went so far. The soldier's mind wandered back to home, back to the quiet streets he had left behind, the laughter of his sister, the smell of bread from the bakery near the corner. He clung to those memories like a lifeline, a reminder that there was something beyond this valley, beyond mud and fear. Yet the more he thought of home, the more he feared never seeing it again. The thought tightened his grip on his weapon until his hand ached. The march stretched on, each step echoing with unspoken dread. Somewhere, in the back of the soldier's mind, a voice whispered that they were being watched. He tried to push it away, but it persisted. It was not just paranoia. It was instinct, honed by weeks of near misses and sudden ambushes. He had learned to trust that instinct, and now it screamed that something was wrong. His eyes darted up to the ridge again, searching for movement. For a moment, he thought he saw the faintest glimmer of metal among the rocks. His stomach dropped. Was it a trick of the light, or was it the sun catching on a rifle scope? He wanted to shout, to warn the others, but his throat clenched shut. What if he was wrong? What if he panicked the column for nothing? He stole a glance at the colonel. The older man's jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed at the ridge. The soldier realized the colonel had seen it too, or something like it. But, instead of raising the alarm, the colonel pressed forward, his stride unbroken. That was the way of war, to carry on as though death wasn't already measuring the distance. The soldier swallowed hard and kept walking. Every step felt like walking across thin ice, unsure of when it would crack beneath him. Yet he stayed in line, his rifle ready, his heart pounding. He didn't know that within minutes, his insignia, the patch he had worn with pride, would become the very thing that drew the enemy's eye. He didn't know that survival would hang on the words of the man striding fearlessly ahead of him. For now, there was only the march, the valley, and the silence. A silence so deep it seemed to lean in, listening. A silence that promised the storm was coming. The first shot tore through the silence like a whip crack. For a split second, the valley itself seemed to flinch. The sound ricocheted off the ridges, sharp and merciless, before dissolving into the heavy air. The column froze, hearts hammering, minds racing to catch up with what their ears had already confirmed. The enemy had eyes on them. The young soldier didn't think. He dropped flat, cheek pressed against the mud, rifle clutched to his chest. The taste of earth filled his mouth, bitter and metallic, but it was better than the taste of blood. Around him, men cursed, scrambled, and fell into the dirt, their formation unraveling in a single heartbeat. Training screamed at them to hold the line, but instinct demanded survival. Another shot rang out. This time the young soldier heard the whistle, a high-pitched shriek as the bullet sliced through the air. It passed so close he felt it in his bones, a vibration that rattled his teeth. The ground beside him spat mud where the round struck. For an instant, he thought he had been hit. His shoulder tingled, and he clawed at it, expecting to find blood. There was none, only the tremble of muscles wound tight as wire. He realized, with icy clarity, that the enemy wasn't firing blindly. The first shot had been a warning, a probe. The second had been meant for him, the insignia. It gleamed faintly on his shoulder, a patch of fabric that marked him as something more than just another man in mud. He wasn't an officer, not yet, but he wore the stripes of someone trusted to guide others. To the enemy, that was enough. Cut down a leader, even a small one, and the rest might falter. Fear could spread faster than bullets. The soldier pressed himself deeper into the ground, as if he could vanish into the soil. His mind screamed, "Rip it off. Tear away the patch. Make yourself invisible." His hand hovered over it, trembling, ready to shred it free. But something stopped him. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. Or the faint hope that if he stayed still enough, the enemy would lose interest. The column had dissolved into chaos. Men shouted over one another, voices breaking with panic. Where's it coming from? Someone yelled. Another cursed, blind firing toward the ridge. The shots went wild, harmlessly shattering stone. Each wasted bullet was another reminder that they were fighting ghosts they couldn't see. The colonel's voice cut through the noise. Down! Stay low! His tone was iron, unshaken, and it anchored them, pulling scattered men back into some semblance of order. The soldier risked a glance upward. Through the haze of panic, he caught sight of movement on the ridge, a flash of light, the faint silhouette of a man against the rocks. A rifle barrel, steady as death, trained directly on him. Time slowed. He saw the marksman's calm precision, the way the figure leaned into the shot, unhurried. He knew in his gut the bullet would find him this time. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact that would rip through flesh and bone. But the shot never came. Instead, another sound cut across the valley, the colonel's boots slapping mud as he rose from cover. The soldier's eyes flew open. There he was out in the open, tall and defiant, his figure framed against the ridge. Bullets still cracked, but the colonel didn't flinch. He moved deliberately, almost casually, as though daring the enemy to notice him. "Hold steady," the colonel barked. His men hesitated, torn between awe and disbelief. Who in his right mind stood tall when death crouched in the rocks above? Yet the colonel's voice carried authority that didn't bend. The soldier's heart thudded. Why wasn't the colonel ducking? Why expose himself when he was the most valuable target of all? Then it struck him. The colonel wasn't just protecting himself. He was drawing fire away from the rest. The young. Soldier's insignia had made him a target, but the colonel's presence commanding, unmistakable, dwarfed all others. Another shot cracked. The bullet sliced past the colonel's sleeve, tearing fabric but missing flesh. The colonel didn't stop. He stood straighter. His gaze never wavered from the ridge. The enemy was watching. The men were watching. And in that moment, the colonel wasn't just a man, he was a wall. The soldier's fear twisted into something else, something sharp and hot. Awe. He had been seconds from ripping off his insignia, ready to shrink back into the anonymity of mud. But the colonel was showing him something different. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing tall in its teeth. More bullets rained down, striking rocks, throwing shards of stone into the air. The noise was deafening, a storm of sound. Men flinched, ducked, cursed. Yet they saw their leader still standing, and slowly, instinctively, they began to steady. Panic gave way to grit. If he could face the ridge unbroken, then maybe they could too. The soldier pressed his cheek harder into the dirt, not out of fear this time, but out of respect. He knew his place. He wasn't ready to stand like that, not yet. But he would follow. Whatever happened next, he would follow. The valley was no longer silent. It was alive with gunfire and shouts. But somewhere in the chaos, the soldier understood that this was only the beginning. The first shots were not the end of them. They were the test, the moment when fear tried to splinter them apart. And the colonel had answered, not with bullets, but with presence. The soldier's heart pounded in rhythm with the rifle fire. He clenched his weapon tighter, waiting for the order to rise, to fight, to take back the valley one shot at a time. The ridge had revealed itself. The enemy had shown its hand. And though death still crouched above, the men had something stronger than fear. They had a line that refused to break. And for the soldier with the stripes on his shoulder, the truth became clear. He wasn't just carrying a patch of fabric. He was carrying expectation, responsibility, and the weight of men who would look to him when orders came. The enemy could aim for his shoulder all they wanted. What they couldn't see, what they couldn't kill, was the spirit rising in the mud around him. The storm had begun, and somehow he was still alive. The valley stank of smoke and fear. Gunpowder drifted through the damp air, stinging noses and eyes, while the echo of rifle fire faded into uneasy silence. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of men pressed low against the mud, each one listening for the next shot that might end his life. The young soldier dared a glance upward. His heart sank. The glint on the ridge was no illusion. There was definitely a marksman up there, patient and merciless. And he knew exactly who the rifle was hunting. Him. The realization was like ice in his veins. He understood now why the first 2 bullets had skimmed so close. One buzzing like an angry hornet past his ear, the other chewing mud beside his arm. They hadn't been misses. They had been warnings or practice shots. The enemy wasn't wasting ammunition, spraying the line at random. No, the marksman had chosen his target. And that target was him. He looked down at the fabric on his shoulder. The insignia, darkened with damp earth, but still visible. Stripes that should have been a badge of honor, now burned against his skin like a curse. A patch didn't just mark him as a leader. It made him a beacon for death. His hand twitched toward it. Rip it off. Strip it away. He could do it in seconds here. Free the stitching, bury it in the mud, make himself invisible again. Without it, he'd just be another face in the crowd. The barrel on the ridge might move on, searching for a bigger prize. But his hand froze. Something inside him resisted the urge. Was it pride? Stubbornness? Or fear that his men would see him strip it off and know, instantly, that their leader had chosen survival over responsibility? He imagined their eyes on him, watching, judging. If he abandoned the patch, what else might he abandon when the fighting grew worse? He pulled his hand back, fingers trembling. The insignia stayed. A shout erupted nearby as one of the privates fired blindly toward the ridge. The shot sparked harmlessly off stone, but it drew answering fire. Another bullet cracked down, skimming. A helmet, and leaving the soldier gasping in shock. Panic surged in, rippling through the line. Men shifted, voices overlapping in confusion. The young soldier pressed his face into the mud, trying to stay calm. But his chest burned with dread. The patch on his shoulder felt heavier than lead. He wasn't just another target. He was the target. And the colonel knew it. The soldier risked another glance and caught sight of the older man crouched a few yards ahead. The colonel's gaze wasn't on the ridge anymore. It was on him. Their eyes met briefly through the haze, and in that instant, the soldier felt exposed, not just to the enemy, but to his commander's scrutiny. The colonel had seen the marksman's intent. He knew who was being hunted. Yet the colonel didn't signal him to hide, didn't tell him to strip away the insignia. Instead, the colonel's expression hardened into something fierce. His jaw set, his shoulders squared, and he rose higher from cover. The young soldier's breath caught. Why? Is he standing up? Another crack, another shot. This one closer, vicious in its precision. The bullet ripped a chunk from the ground near the colonel's boot. Still, the older man didn't waver. He moved forward, calmly, deliberately, exposing himself to fire as though daring the enemy to shift aim. The soldier felt a surge of shame. He had wanted to crawl deeper into the mud, to vanish from sight. The colonel, meanwhile, was doing the opposite, stepping out where death could see him clearly. A private nearby muttered, "He's insane." But his voice carried a tremor that wasn't scorn. It was awe. The colonel's presence began to pull the men back from the edge of panic. His defiance was a magnet, drawing their scattered courage into a single point. Where fear had fractured them moments before, now unity flickered in their eyes. Still, the soldier's terror gnawed at him. He knew the marksman hadn't given up. Somewhere up on that ridge, a steady hand was adjusting a scope, aligning crosshairs. With his shoulder once again, the next shot would be perfect. And this time, he might not be so lucky. He flattened himself against the earth, heart slamming in his chest. He wanted to shout at the colonel, to beg him to order the men back, to do something other than stand like a beacon in the open. But the words stuck in his throat, because deep down, he understood. The colonel wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for them all. He was shifting the weight of the target, taking it upon his own shoulders. If the enemy wanted civils, let them fire at the highest one. The colonel's message was wordless but undeniable. Shoot at me, not at him. The soldier's throat tightened. His insignia no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a promise. A burden, yes, but one he couldn't abandon. Not while the man ahead of him was willing to bear something even heavier. Another bullet cracked. It hissed so close to his ear that it burned. He gasped, hand clenching the dirt. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a tunnel of fear. But when his vision cleared, he saw the colonel still standing, unbroken. And in that sight, the soldier found a fragment of courage he hadn't known was left in him. He shifted his rifle, steadied his breath, and waited for the next command. The valley was still alive with danger, the ridge crawling with unseen enemies. But something had changed. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled them. The young soldier had been marked as a target, yet in that moment he realized he was more than prey. He was part of a line fragile, battered, but held together by the will of one man who refused to kneel. And as long as that line stood, so would he. The enemy could aim for his shoulder all they wanted, but they would never touch what the colonel had awakened, the fire that burned beneath the patch. The ridge was alive with invisible teeth, each bullet snapping down from above with surgical precision. Every man in the valley knew the enemy could finish them here if panic won. Fear spread like smoke, choking lungs and clouding judgment. Younger soldiers pressed themselves deeper into the mud, rifles clutched in shaking hands, too terrified to lift their heads. But then the colonel moved. At first, it was subtle a shift of his shoulders, a deliberate lifting from cover as if he were merely brushing off dirt. But then he stood fully, boots sinking into the wet ground, his frame unmistakable against the gray backdrop of the valley. His presence was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just standing, he was commanding the very air. The young soldier, still trembling under the weight of the target on his shoulder, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Why? Why would he rise? Now, when every rifle on the ridge was hungry for blood? The colonel didn't rise recklessly. Every motion was calculated. He wasn't striding forward like a madman. He was stepping deliberately, as though telling both his men and the enemy, I am unafraid. I am unbroken. A shot cracked. The bullet carved the air near his chest, close enough to tear a button from his coat. The fabric fluttered loose, yet the colonel's stride didn't falter. His eyes narrowed on the ridge, scanning the rocks with a predator's call. He carried no shield but his own defiance, and it was more powerful than any armor. The men stared. For a breathless moment, they forgot their fear. Watching him was like watching a mountain rise immovable, uncheckable. Hold your fire. The colonel barked, his voice carrying over the chaos. The words snapped through the line like a whip. Men who had been blind firing toward the ridge lowered their rifles, waiting, unsure. The colonel reached the center of the valley floor and stopped. He planted his boots firmly, as though anchoring himself against the storm. His gaze swept across his men, then back up toward the ridge where death lurked. The young soldier felt his chest tighten. He realized the colonel wasn't hiding him, wasn't even hiding himself. He was showing himself, daring the marksman to choose. By stepping forward, he wasn't just shifting the target. He was declaring to the enemy that rank and courage were worth more than their bullets. Another shot rang out. The soldier flinched, expecting the colonel to fall. Instead, the bullet chipped stone behind him, harmless. The colonel didn't blink. He raised his voice again, calm yet thunderous. Eyes on me, boys. His words rolled across the valley, steadying frayed nerves. You see where I stand? That's where you'll stand. We don't break. Not here. Not now. The line stirred. Men exchanged glances, breath coming steadier. The fear was still there. It always would be, but the colonel's defiance was stronger. The young soldier lifted his head from the mud, just enough to see him clearly. The patch on his shoulder still burned like a brand, but now he felt less. Alone beneath its weight. If the colonel could stand tall under fire, then surely he could at least raise his rifle and meet the enemy's eyes. More bullets fell. Each one tested the colonel's resolve, but none bent it. His men began to shift, no longer scrambling to hide, but tightening their grips, aligning themselves with purpose. The valley was still a killing ground, but the tide within their hearts had shifted. The colonel finally lifted his rifle, not to fire, but to point directing their eyes toward the ridge. His gesture was crisp, controlled, like a conductor summoning order from chaos. "Steady," he commanded. "Wait for it." The soldiers. Pulse hammered. He swallowed hard, every nerve on edge. Around him, the others waited too, their fear tempered by the steel of the man who refused to kneel. The colonel's voice dropped lower now, but it carried all the same. "They think we're prey. They think we'll scatter. But you're not prey, you're a line. And a line doesn't run. A line holds." The soldier felt the words sink into him, heavier than bullets, sharper than fear. He thought of his insignia again, not as a target, but as a bond. A promise to stand, not just for himself, but for every man beside him. The colonel shifted his stance, shoulder square, rifle steady at his side. Then, in one final act of defiance, he raised his chin toward the ridge, as though speaking directly to the unseen marksman. "You want a target?" His voice rang out, deep and unyielding. "Here I am." The valley fell silent, as if even the enemy paused to hear him. The colonel's figure stood clear against the mud and mist, every line of his body declaring what no bullet could erase. This is what leadership looks like. This is what courage sounds like. The young soldier gritted his teeth, heart swelling with something fierce. Fear still lived in him, yes, but now it had company. It lived beside pride, beside resolve. He knew, as every man in that valley knew, that the colonel had stepped forward not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted them to live. And in that moment, the line began to rise. The valley was still alive with fire. Shots cracked down from the ridge, each one aimed with cruel patience. Each one intended to break the line before it could gather itself. Mud splashed and rocks shattered under the weight of bullets. Yet, through it all, the colonel stood firm, an unshaken pillar in the storm. The young soldier felt the sting of dirt whip across his face as another round tore into the ground nearby. His instincts screamed to flatten, to burrow into the soil like a worm. But when his eyes lifted to the colonel's silhouette, he found himself fighting those instincts. The man's defiance was magnetic. To look at him was to feel something shift inside, a reminder that they were not animals, scrambling for cover, but soldiers bound together. The enemy fire came faster now, angry at being resisted. A bullet grazed the colonel's sleeve, tearing fabric and leaving a fresh scar of powder burn across his arm. Gasps rippled through the men, but the colonel didn't flinch. He raised his chin, squaring his shoulders with deliberate calm, and bellowed words that froze both friend and foe alike. "This outranks yours." The declaration crashed across the valley, louder than the rifles, more piercing than fear. It wasn't just a boast. It wasn't even directed solely at the enemy. It was a promise to his men, to himself, to history. The colonel was saying, "Your bullets mean nothing compared to the authority I carry, the courage I command, and the line that stands behind me." The young soldier felt his chest swell, as if those words had been shouted into his very bones. The Insignia on his shoulder no longer felt like a curse. It felt like armor, fused by the colonel's defiance. If the enemy wanted to target symbols, then let them. A symbol that stood tall in the open, unbroken by fire, was stronger than any rifle. The ridge faltered. For the first time, the steady rhythm of enemy shots stuttered, thrown off by the colonel's sheer audacity. They had aimed to intimidate, to carve fear into the hearts of those below. Instead, they had found themselves challenged not by return fire, but by an idea louder than steel: we do not bow. On your feet, the colonel roared, pointing his rifle upward like a banner. One by one, men began to rise from the mud. Hesitant at first, then with growing certainty. The young soldier pushed himself up, knees shaking but spirit burning. Around him, rifles leveled toward the ridge, no longer firing wildly, but held with discipline, waiting for the order. The colonel's gaze swept across them, and for the first time that day, he nodded. Now, he said, voice steady as stone. The line fired as one. A thunderclap of rifles shattered the valley, echoing off the ridges in defiance. Bullets ripped into stone, sparks and shards exploding where the enemy had hidden. The coordinated volley was not just a strike, it was a statement. They were no longer prey. They were a wall. The young soldier fired with them, the kick of the rifle jolting him back into himself. He saw figures on the ridge scramble, their confidence shaken. Another volley followed, and another, each one steadier than the last. Fear still lived in their bones, but now it was harnessed, sharpened, transformed into resolve. Through it all, the colonel stood tall, firing only when necessary, conserving his shots. His true weapon wasn't the rifle, it was his presence. The enemy could aim at his chest, at his head, at the insignia on his shoulders, but none of their bullets carried the weight of his words. This outranks yours. He shouted again, each repetition hammering the message deeper. It became a rhythm, a battle cry, a shield. The men echoed it in their hearts, if not aloud, each shot from their rifles an unspoken chorus. This outranks yours. This outranks yours. The ridge's fire thinned. The enemy wasn't broken yet, but hesitation had wormed its way into their ranks. Marksmen who had fired with steady hands now shifted uneasily, knowing they were no longer shooting if frightened. Prey, but at soldiers who refused to bend. The young soldier lowered his rifle for a moment, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the colonel. He realized he was witnessing more than a skirmish. This was a moment that would live beyond the valley, beyond the mud and smoke. This was a moment of legend, because words like those didn't just echo once. They carved themselves into the hearts of men, to be carried forward, repeated and remembered. The colonel reloaded, calm as ever, his motions precise. Stand tall. Boys, he called. They can take shots at our shoulders all day. But courage? Courage outranks them all. The soldier gripped his weapon tighter, no longer trembling. He felt the truth of it settle into him like iron. He wasn't a marked man anymore. He was part of a legacy being written in real-time one. Forged not in medals or maps, but in defiance shouted against the sound of rifles. The valley thundered again as the line held. And though death still lurked above, every man knew it now. They would not be broken. Not here. Not under this colonel. Not with those words burning in their chests. The valley roared with the rhythm of rifles. Smoke curled upward in ragged trails, drifting toward the ridge like gray banners of defiance. Each volley cracked in unison, a steady drumbeat that pushed back against the chaos. The colonel's words still echoed in the soldier's mind. This outranks yours, and with every shot, that truth felt more alive. The young soldier wiped grime from his cheek with a trembling hand. His body was exhausted, nerves frayed, Yet something deeper kept him moving. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was duty. The insignia on his shoulder no longer burned like a target. It pulsed like a reminder of who he was expected to be. Keep it steady. The colonel barked, his voice cutting through the haze. Don't waste rounds, make them count. The men obeyed, their panic tempered into discipline. Where moments ago they had fired wildly into the rocks, now their shots were measured, aimed, deliberate. For the first time since entering the valley, the line looked like soldiers again, not prey, not scattered, but a single living force bound by resolve. From the ridge came return fire, but it was no longer steady. Bullets chipped stone, scattered dust, hissed past ears, but the precision was gone. The enemy had lost their rhythm. The colonel had stolen it. The young soldier raised his rifle, sighted along the barrel, and fired. He thought he saw a figure topple among the rocks. Whether it was true or imagination, it didn't matter. The act of firing calm, controlled, unafraid, was victory in itself. Around him, his comrades were changing. The private who had once cursed and fired blindly now crouched with sharp focus, reloading with steady hands. Another, who had frozen stiff in terror, rose to a knee and aimed with the confidence of a man who knew he was no longer alone. The colonel hadn't just commanded them. He had given them back to themselves. Another volley tore from the line, the sound deafening, rattling the valley walls. Smoke stung the soldier's eyes, but he didn't falter. He reloaded quickly, fingers slick with sweat and dirt, then fired again. Each trigger pull was a declaration. We hold. We do not break. A shot from the ridge cracked dangerously close. The soldier flinched, then realized it hadn't been aimed at him this time. The enemy's focus had shifted, scattered between too many targets. The colonel's gamble had worked. The marksman could no longer single one man out when the entire line stood tall together. Still, the danger was real. A scream rose from the left flank, where a man went down, clutching his leg. Blood seeped into the mud, turning it black. The young soldier's stomach twisted, but the colonel's voice steadied them before panic could. Return. Medic, get him safe. The rest eyes forward. We hold this ground. The command was firm, but not cruel. The colonel acknowledged the fallen, without letting grief fracture the living. It was a delicate balance, one only a true leader could maintain. The soldier swallowed hard, tightening his grip. He realized the colonel wasn't just keeping them alive, he was teaching them. Every word, every motion, every risk he took was a lesson in how to lead when fear threatened to take everything. Another crack of rifles echoed. This time, the line didn't just endure, they pressed back. Step by step, inch by inch, they moved forward through the mud. The colonel led from the center, not hiding behind cover, but standing where his men could see him, where they could measure their courage against his. The soldier found himself rising higher than he thought possible. His knees ached, his shoulders burned, but his back straightened as if pulled by invisible strings. For the first time since entering the valley, he felt like more than a target. He felt like part of a wall, a force that could not be toppled by bullets alone. Forward, the colonel commanded. His voice was hoarse from shouting, yet it carried the same iron weight as before. And forward they went. The valley floor was slick, churned into muck by boots and blood, but the line advanced. Each step was defiance. Each shot was a refusal. The enemy fire grew more desperate, less precise. Where once they had hunted calmly, now they scrambled, forced onto the defensive. The young soldier fired again, his rifle bucking in his hands. He no longer flinched at the sound of return fire. He no longer reached for the insignia on his shoulder. Instead, he squared his stance and pressed forward, knowing the man ahead had already proven what courage demanded. At one point, he glanced sideways and caught the eyes of another soldier, a boy no older than himself, face smeared with dirt, eyes wide but steady. They shared no words, but the message passed between them. We hold, we rise together. The colonel's voice cut through once more, loud enough to shake the smoke itself. They'll break before we do. The ridge answered with another volley, but the rhythm was fractured, uneven. The young soldier knew the truth. The colonel was right. It wasn't just about bullets anymore. It was about will. And will, once forged, was harder to shatter than stone. The battle raged on, mud and smoke swallowing details, but the essence remained clear. The enemy fired. The line held. The colonel stood. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridges, the valley no longer felt like a trap. It felt like ground claimed, not by numbers, not by firepower, but by the sheer refusal of men to kneel. The young soldier slumped briefly against his rifle, sweat dripping, chest heaving. He was exhausted beyond measure. Yet, when he lifted his eyes and saw the colonel still upright, still scanning the ridge with unyielding calm, strength returned. They had held. Against precision, against fear, against death itself, they had held. And in the silence between volleys, the soldier finally understood. The colonel's words were not just defiance shouted in the face of a sniper. They were a creed, a way of being. This outranks yours, not just rank, not just insignia, but courage, resolve, unity. And nothing the enemy fired could ever outrank that. The sun had begun its slow crawl down the sky, spilling long shadows across the valley. Smoke still clung to the air, wrapping the ground in a choking haze, but beneath it, all the lines stood unbroken. What had started as a panicked scramble in the mud had transformed into a force with one heartbeat, one rhythm, one will. The colonel's voice carried even as it grew ragged from shouting. "Steady, keep your spacing, watch the ridge." His words cut through the roar of rifles, like steel through cloth, and the men obeyed without hesitation. The young soldier's arms ached from the constant rhythm of fire and reload, fire and reload. His shoulder throbbed from the rifle's recoil. His ears rang with the endless thunder of combat, but he no longer noticed the pain. His fear had burned away, consumed by something harder, resolve. The insignia on his shoulder no longer weighed him down. It pushed him forward. The ridge still spat fire, but the pattern had changed. The enemy was no longer precise, no longer calm. Their shots cracked in bursts, frantic, uncoordinated. Once they had been hunters, their scopes zeroed on single men. Now they were prey, behind their own rocks, answering desperation with noise. The colonel seized the moment. Forward, he bellowed, raising his rifle like a sword. His silhouette was framed against the ridge, defiant as ever. Take the ground from under them. The line surged. Boots pounded mud, splashing through trenches carved by bullets and blood. The soldiers advanced shoulder to shoulder, rifles raised, eyes fixed on the ridge above. Every step was defiance carved into the earth. The young soldier's chest hammered, breath tearing in his lungs, but he pressed forward with the rest. He fired upward, saw sparks explode where his bullet struck stone, and heard the sharp cry of an enemy forced back into cover. For the first time, the ridge seemed vulnerable. The enemy answered with another volley, but it was wild, scattered. A bullet clipped the edge of the soldier's helmet, sending a ringing shock through his skull. He stumbled, nearly falling, but the colonel's voice snapped him upright again. "On your feet, son. The ridge is cracking." The soldier gritted his teeth and rose. His knees shook, but his spirit burned brighter. The colonel's words were no longer just orders. They were fuel, poured into the fire that drove them upward. Step by step, volley by volley, the line closed the distance. The ridge loomed closer, its shadows no longer a place of terror, but a fortress to be taken. The young soldier saw flashes of movement above enemies, shifting, panicked, uncertain. They were faltering. The colonel strode among his men, calm even in chaos. His coat was torn, his sleeves stained with blood where a bullet had grazed him, yet his stride was steady, his eyes sharp. He called out encouragement, not as a distant commander, but as a man in the fight, his presence grounding every soldier. Around him, "They'll run before we do." He roared, "Hold fast, give them nothing." The line answered with another thunderous volley. Rifles cracked in unison, smoke blooming upward like storm clouds. Stones shattered along the ridge, and one figure toppled, tumbling down the rocks before disappearing into the mud below. A cheer erupted from the men, fierce and guttural, the sound of spirits rising. The young soldier joined the cry, his throat raw. He felt the energy surge through him, fierce and undeniable. The colonel's words, his defiance, his refusal to bow, they had taken root in all of them. They weren't just holding the line anymore. They were breaking the enemy's will. The ridge's fire thinned further. Where once there had been a storm of bullets, now there were gaps, longer pauses, fewer cracks of rifles. The young soldier sensed it. The enemy was losing heart. The colonel raised his rifle high. His voice thundered, ragged but unyielding. "This outrank's yours." The men roared with him, a chorus that shook the valley. The words became more than a phrase. They became a hammer, pounding into the enemy's spirit. Another volley followed, timed with perfection, and the ridge shuddered under the weight of it. Figures scrambled, abandoning cover, retreating deeper into the rocks. The once invisible marksmen were now exposed, running, not hunters anymore, but men fleeing the fire they had tried to kindle. The young soldier's chest surged with pride. He fired again, each shot steadier than the last, his fear now fully gone. The insignia on his shoulder was no longer a target, it was a banner, a sign of the line he belonged to, the line that would not break. The colonel advanced with them, never faltering. His presence was a wall of iron, his defiance a shield. Bullets still flew, danger still clawed at them, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The ridge was breaking. At last, the enemy fire sputtered into silence. The smoke lifted slightly, revealing scattered figures retreating along the crest, their rifles abandoned in their haste. The valley echoed with the sound of their flight, boots clattering against stone as they vanished into the distance. The line did not cheer this time. Not yet. They held, rifles trained, waiting for the colonel's word. He lowered his weapon slowly, scanning the ridge with sharp eyes. Only when he was satisfied that the enemy was gone did he finally nod. They're finished. Relief broke across the men like a wave. Shouts of victory rose, some joyous, some exhausted, some simply the release of breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. The young soldier slumped to his knees, chest heaving, tears stinging his eyes, though he couldn't tell if they were from smoke or triumph. The colonel turned, his gaze sweeping over his men. His voice was softer now, but no less steady. "You see what we did here? They thought they could break us. They thought their rifles outranked our courage. But you stood, every one of you, and now look at the ridge, it's yours." The words sank deep. The men had not only survived, they had claimed something intangible yet indestructible. They had proven to themselves, to the enemy, to history, that a line of determined men, bound by trust and led by courage, could hold against anything. The young soldier lifted his eyes to the ridge. For the first time, it didn't loom over him like a tomb. It rose before him like a monument. A reminder that fear had tried to bury them here, and they had risen instead. The ridge lay silent. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, its acrid stench clinging to the valley like a ghost of the battle just fought. The sun, now dipping low, painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. The enemy was gone driven. Back, scattered beyond the rocks, but the weight of the fight lingered heavy on the air. The young soldier sank into the mud, chest heaving. His arms felt like lead, his rifle a stone in his hands. Every muscle screamed for rest, but his eyes stayed locked on the colonel. A man stood upright at the center of the valley, blood streaking his sleeve, uniform torn, yet his presence as solid as ever. He had not just survived the battle, he had defined it. Around them, the line began to reform. Medics rushed to the wounded, lifting men onto stretchers, binding bleeding limbs with strips of cloth. Survivors helped one another, gripping arms, pulling comrades from the muck. The valley that had begun as a graveyard in waiting now pulsed with the quiet strength of men who had endured. The young soldier looked down at his shoulder. The insignia was smeared with dirt and blood, the threads fraying at the edges. But instead of tearing it away, he brushed it clean with careful fingers. It no longer felt like a mark of danger. It felt like inheritance proof that he had borne the target, faced the fire, and remained standing. The colonel's voice broke the silence. It was softer now, but it carried just as far. You held. Every head turned toward him. His gaze swept over the men, lingering on each face as though memorizing them. They tried to strip you of courage. They tried to make you pray. But you held. The words sank into the soldier's bones. He remembered the first crack of the rifle, the terror that had gripped him when he realized he was being hunted. He remembered the weight of the insignia, the urge to rip it free and hide. And he remembered the colonel, rising tall, daring death to strike him instead. History won't count how many shots were fired here, the colonel continued, his voice steady. It will remember that you did not break. The line was silent, but the silence was thick with pride. The soldier realized he was trembling, not from fear, but from something heavier. He had seen death that day, felt it brush his skin, whisper in his ear, but he had also seen what it meant to live beyond fear. He had witnessed a man who turned courage into a weapon stronger than any rifle. A medic passed by, urging the soldier to sit so his bruises could be checked, but he waved him off. His pain could wait. He needed to hear every word. The colonel looked to the ridge, its jagged crest now stripped of its menace. They'll tell stories of this place. They'll say it was mud and smoke and gunfire. But I'll tell you what. It really was proof. Proof that a line, when it stands together, outranks anything the enemy can throw. The soldier's throat tightened. He thought of the moment the colonel had shouted those words. This outranks yours. And how they had lit a fire in every man's chest. The phrase would outlive the battle. It was already legend. As dusk settled, the men began to prepare for the night. Fires were lit, not for warmth, but for light, and the valley glowed with flickering flames. The wounded rested, the dead were gathered with solemn hands, and the living sat in quiet clusters, their conversations hushed but steady. The young soldier sat with his rifle across his knees, staring at the ridge. He felt older than he had that morning, aged not by years, but by fire. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange peace. The colonel passed by, pausing when he reached him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, one seasoned, one young, both marked by the same battle. The colonel's eyes softened. You did well, son. The soldier swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. I thought I'd break, sir. The colonel's gaze dropped briefly to the insignia on his shoulder, then lifted again. You didn't. That's what matters. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the entire day. When the colonel moved on, the soldier exhaled. Shakily. He realized then that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing despite it. And that was the true meaning of the patch on his shoulder. As the night deepened, Stars pricked the sky above the valley. The men spoke of the day in low tones, already shaping it into memory. They spoke of bullets that missed by inches, of friends who refused to falter, of the colonel's voice echoing louder than gunfire. They spoke of a line that had held when it should have broken. The young soldier listened, his eyes drifting back to the ridge. He knew that one day, long after the smoke had cleared and the valley had healed, people would ask what had happened here, and he knew the answer would not be in the number of shots fired or the ground gained. The answer would be in the words shouted by one man who stood when no one else dared. "This outranks yours." The phrase would carry forward, whispered in training grounds, shouted in battlefields, etched into the memory of every man who had been there. It would become more than defiance. It would become creed. The soldier finally closed his eyes, leaning back against the earth. Exhaustion pulled at him, but beneath it was something steady, something that would never leave him. He had marched into the valley with fear. He would march out of it with fire. And when he did, he would carry the lesson forever. That courage, when shared, outranked everything.